Welcome back to the Transition Room. This is episode 8. And if you've been here from the very beginning, thank you. Because what we've built over the last several weeks is not just a series of conversations, it's been a journey and a real one.
We started in a very specific place. We started with the moment everything falls apart. The call you didn't expect, the role that dissolved overnight, the morning you log in and your access is gone. And we asked, what actually breaks in that moment? Not your resume, not your skills, your identity.
And from there, we went deeper. We talked about why the most hardworking women are often the ones who get passed over, not because they weren't ready or good enough, but because performance and promotability are two completely different games.
We talked about the competence trap, how being too good at what you do can quietly become the reason you stop moving forward. Because when you're the person who holds everything together, the system cannot afford to lose you from that seat.
We sat with the hardest question most professionals carry alone. Should I leave? Or is this just a phase? And we didn't give you a quick answer because that question deserves more than that.
Then we got personal. We talked about what happens when life stops cooperating with your career plan, when your family, your health, your priorities start pulling in a completely different direction. And we said something that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Balance is a myth. What you actually need is alignment.
We talked about pace, about what happens when you're moving faster than your environment, or when your environment is moving faster than you, and how that gap, that mismatch, is often what people mistake for a personal failing.
And last week, we went somewhere very quiet. We talked about the invisible trade off, the cost of success that nobody puts on a job description. How every yes you said over the years also quietly said no to something else. And how you usually don't see that until it's already shaped your entire life.
8 weeks, 8 conversations, and every single one of them was building towards this. The question that sits underneath all of it.
Because here's what we have noticed: most people spend their entire careers chasing a version of success that never stop to actually define it. More responsibility, more visibility, more money, more, more, more. And for a long time, that works. It gives you the direction, it gives you the momentum, it gives you something to move towards.
But at some point, and if you've been listening to the series, you probably know exactly what we mean. The question starts to change. It stops being what's next and it becomes something much harder. What am I actually doing this for?
And that is where today's conversation begins. Because today we are not talking about how to get more. We are talking about something far more difficult. How do you know when you have had enough? So let's start with something honest. The word enough makes most high achievers comfortable. And no, I'm sorry, makes people more uncomfortable. And I mean genuinely uncomfortable, not in a small way, in a change the subject, pivot to a new goal, open LinkedIn kind of a way.
Because we've been conditioned to hear enough as a synonym for giving up. If you say you have enough, people assume you've stopped caring. That's where you've lost your edge. The ambition has left the building.
And nobody wants to be that person, the one who settled, the one who stopped pushing, the one who could have gone further but didn't. So instead, we keep moving. We set the next goal, we take the next opportunity, and we tell ourselves, not yet, not quite yet.
But here's what we want you to sit with for a moment. Where did that come from? Who told you that wanting enough was the same as wanting less?
Because there's a version of ambition that comes from a real, clear, honest place. You know what you want, you're building towards it deliberately, and the drive feels energizing. because it's yours.
And then there's a version of ambition that looks identical from the outside, but feels very different on the inside. It's not really desire pulling you forward, it's anxiety pushing you. The fear of being irrelevant, the fear of falling behind, the fear that if you slow down even for a moment, something will be taken from you.
And that uncomfortable truth is most of us have been running on that second version for longer than we'd want to admit. Not because we are broken, but because that's what the system rewards: urgency, momentum, the next thing.
We talked in episode 1 about identity, about how your sense of self can become so fused with your professional structure that when the structure itself falls away, you don't know who you are anymore. This is the same thing, just at a different altitude. When your identity is built around striving, all around always having a next goal, always being in motion, the idea of arriving somewhere feels less like relief and more like loss.
So, before we even get into what enough looks like, we have to be honest about this. The reason this question is so hard is not because the answer is complicated, it's because we have never really let ourselves ask it seriously.
So let's ask it now. Not as a threat, not as a signal that you're giving up, but as one of the most important questions a high functioning, high achieving person can sit with. When was the last time you genuinely felt satisfied? Not excited about what's coming next, not relieved that something hard was over. Satisfied. Like, this is good. This is actually good.
Take a moment with that because a lot of people, that feeling is harder to access than it should be. And that gap between how much you have built and how little you have left yourself to feel it, that's where today's conversation really begins.
So let's talk about something that almost nobody admits out loud. You hit your goal, the one you've been working towards, the promotion you wanted, the salary you told yourself would feel like enough, the title you spent 3 years building towards. You hit it. And for a moment, it feels good.
And then, almost immediately, something else happens: a new benchmark, a new ceiling, a new version of not quite there yet.
And you think, okay, maybe I just need to push a little further. That one will feel like enough.
But it doesn't. And this isn't a personal failing. This isn't you being ungrateful or impossible to satisfy. This is how the system is designed.
External markers of success are built to keep moving. Title leads to scope, scope leads to income, income leads to influence, influence leads to legacy. Every time you come across one threshold, the other one or the next one becomes visible, and the game continues.
We talked about this in episode 7 about how every decision you make quietly shapes what comes next, how momentum builds in a direction without you always consciously choosing it. This is the same pattern, but playing out in how you define your own success.
Because here's what's actually happened over time. You stop choosing your goals start choosing you. The next step becomes obvious, not because you sat down and decided it is what you want, but because it's what the path in front of you is already pointing towards.
And this is where it gets really important to separate two things that feel identical but are actually very different.
The first is ambition, that comes from desire. You know what you want, you can feel it. It pulls you forward because it's connected to something real, something that genuinely matters to you.
The second is ambition that comes from anxiety. It also pulls you forward. It also looks like drive from the outside. But it doesn't come from wanting something, it comes from being afraid of what it means if you stop.
Afraid of becoming invisible, afraid of losing relevance, afraid that the moment you slow down, people will stop seeing you as someone who actually matters.
And these two feel almost identical from the inside until they don't. Until you're sitting in a role you worked incredibly hard for. and realizing that getting there hasn't made you feel the way you thought it would.
That's not ingratitude, that's information. That's your internal compass telling you that the goal you hit wasn't actually yours to begin with. It was the goal the path handed to you.
So here's a question worth sitting with honestly. Think about your last big career move, your last significant goal. Were you genuinely drawn towards it? Or were you moving away from something like discomfort, stagnation, fear of failing, and fear of falling behind? And that goal just happened to be the most available direction for you.
There's no wrong answer. Both are real, both happen. But knowing which one is driving you, that changes everything. Because if you're running towards something, you'll know when you've arrived. But if you're running away from something, the goalpost will keep moving. Because the thing you're running from is coming with you.
And that is the real reason enough feels so hard to find. Not because you haven't achieved enough, but because the question, what do I actually want, has never been answered as clearly as it needs to be.
Which is exactly what we're going to get into next.
So let's say something that doesn't get said enough. You can be genuinely successful and still feel like something is missing. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way you could easily explain to someone else. Just a quiet sense that the life you have built doesn't quite fit the person you have become.
And the reason that's so disorienting is because everything around you says you should feel great. The numbers look right, the title is real, the respect is there. So you start questioning yourself. Why isn't this enough? What's actually wrong with me?
But here's what is actually happening. There are two very different things that we collapse into one word, which is success. The first is external achievement, what the system can measure: title, income, scope, recognition. The second is internal satisfaction, what only you can measure. Does this feel meaningful? Does this feel like it's mine? Does the life I'm living reflect the person I actually am?
And for a long time, especially early in your career, those two things move together. You're growing externally, and that growth feels meaningful internally because it's new, because it's proof, because every milestone is confirmation that you belong in the room.
But at some point, they start to separate. External achievement keeps moving forward because that's what it does. There's always another level. But internal satisfaction, that starts asking a very different question.
Not how do I get to the next level, but is the next level actually where I want to go?
And this is the moment most high achieving people are completely unprepared for because nobody trains you for this. Every framework, every mentor, every piece of career advice you have ever received is oriented around external achievement: how to get promoted, how to build visibility, how to negotiate, and how to position yourself.
Nobody sits you down and says, hey, at some point, you need to know what success actually feels like to you. Not to your manager, not to your industry, not to your family, but to you.
And without that clarity, you end up optimizing for signals that belong to someone else's definition of a good career.
Let me make this real for a second. We know someone. Let's call her Priya. Priya spent 12 years building exactly the career she was told that she wanted: senior role, strong team, compensation that made her parents proud, a LinkedIn profile that looked like she had completely figured it out.
And from the outside, she did. But in a conversation we had with her, she said something that stayed with us. She said, I've spent so long building a life that looks right, and I forgot to check whether it feels right.
And that's not a small thing. That's not just a bad week or a difficult quarter or a sign that she needed a holiday. That was the gap between external achievement and internal satisfaction finally becoming too wide to ignore.
And here's what's important to understand. The gap doesn't appear overnight. It builds the same way the invisible trade offs from episode 7 built, quietly, gradually, one reasonable decision at a time.
You keep hitting the external markers because they're clear, because they're measurable, because the world rewards them. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop checking in with the internal ones.
Until one day, you're sitting in a meeting that 6 years ago would have felt like exactly where you wanted to be. And you realize you feel almost nothing. Not unhappy, not ungrateful, just untouched by it.
And that feeling, that quiet disconnection, is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that your internal compass has been trying to tell you something for a while. And this might be the first time you've been still enough to hear it.
So, here's the question we want to leave you with before we move forward. Where in your career right now is there a gap between what looks good from the outside and what actually feels good from the inside? You don't have to have an answer immediately. Just notice where the question lands because that's where the real work is.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into the next level. Because once you can see that gap clearly, the next question becomes, what do you actually do with it? Can we say something that might feel a little confronting now? Ambition is not supposed to stay the same.
And yet, we treat like it should. Like the version of you that was hungry at 27 should be hungry for the exact same things at 42. Like wanting different things now means you've lost something. Like evolution is somehow a betrayal.
But think about that for a second. Everything else about you has changed. How you think, how you make decisions, what you find meaningful, what you're no longer willing to tolerate. What would your ambition be? The one thing that stays frozen in place.
And yet, this is one of the quietest, most unspoken struggles we see in high achieving professionals at a certain age. Not that their ambition has disappeared, but that it had shifted and they don't quite know what to do with that.
Because shifting ambition doesn't come with an announcement. It doesn't tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, just so you know, what you want has changed. It shows up much more quietly than that.
It shows up as a project that once would have excited you now just feels like more work. A promotion you worked towards for 2 years, and when it finally comes, you feel relieved, but not lit up. And a goal you hit, and your first thought is, okay, so what's next? Not, I did it.
And the instinct in those moments is to push through, to tell yourself, I just need to reconnect with my why. I just need to break. I need a break. Sorry about that. I just need to find a new challenge.
And sometimes that's true. Sometimes you do just need a little break. Sometimes a new challenge genuinely reignites things. But sometimes what those moments are actually telling you is something much more significant, that the version of success you've been building towards was designed by a younger version of you, one who had different fears, different needs, a different understanding of what a good life actually looks like.
And here's the part nobody talks about: letting that evolve is not giving up. It is arguably one of the most mature, most self aware things a professional can actually do.
Because the alternative is spending the next decade optimizing for a destination that you've quietly already outgrown.
We've seen this play out in so many ways. Someone who spent years chasing scale, bigger teams, bigger budgets, bigger impact, and then realizes what they actually want is depth. One thing done really well with full attention.
Someone who built their entire identity around visibility, being in the room, being the voice, being seen, and then realize that they are just caving into something much more quieter, work that matters without needing an audience.
Someone who optimized for security for decades because that's what their circumstances required. And then one day looks up and realizes the security is there. It's been there for a while, but they're still making decisions from a place of scarcity that no longer reflects their reality.
None of these people failed. They evolved. And the problem wasn't the evolution, the problem was not giving themselves permission to acknowledge it.
Because acknowledging it feels risky. If you admit that what you want has changed, you have to figure out what that means for your next decision, for the path you're on, for the identity you've built around a particular version of success.
And that is genuinely uncomfortable. We are not going to pretend it isn't. But here's what's more uncomfortable: arriving at the end of a decade and realizing you've spent it chasing something you stopped actually wanting, somewhere in the middle.
So the question isn't, has my ambition changed? It probably has. For most people listening, it has. The real question is, are you giving yourself permission to let it?
And if the answer is no, it's worth asking why. Are you holding on to the older version of your ambition because it still genuinely fits? Or because changing it feels like it would require too much of everything else to change with it?
Because that second reason, as understandable as it is not a good enough reason to spend the next 10 years of your life in the wrong direction.
And this is where the enough question starts to get really specific. Because once you give yourself permission to let your ambition evolve, the next question becomes, okay, so what do I actually want now?
And that is exactly where we're going next.
So let's actually answer the question: what does enough looks like? And before we go further, I want to be really clear about something. Defining enough is not the same as lowering the bar.
I think you should repeat that again, Vidya.
Defining enough is not the same as lowering the bar. It is not settling, it is not shrinking, it is not deciding that you are done growing.
It is something much more precise than that. It is consciously deciding what you are actually building towards and why, instead of just continuing in the direction you happen to already be moving in.
Because here's the difference: settling is accepting less than you want because you don't believe you can have more. Defining enough is knowing what you want clearly, honestly, and recognizing when you have it. Those are completely different things.
One comes from resignation, the other one comes from clarity. And clarity is not the same as giving up.
So, how do you actually find it? Because we know that that's the real question. It's easy to say, just define what you want. It's much harder to actually do it when you're spending years in a system that defined it for you.
And this is where we want to offer something practical. Not a 5 step framework, not a life audit spreadsheet, just three honest questions. Questions that, if you actually sit with them, will tell you more about where you are than any performance review ever could.
The first question is this: what would you need to be true about your work for it to feel meaningful? Not impressive, not successful by someone else's definition, meaningful to you.
And notice, we're not asking what your work looks like right now. We're asking what would need to feel like. Because meaningful is an internal experience and not an external one.
Some people answer this and realize they need to feel like they are building something, not just maintaining something. Some people realize they need to feel genuinely challenged and not just be busy. And some people realize they need to feel connected to people they're working with, not just productive alongside them.
And none of those answers are wrong, but they are very different. And knowing your answer, your real answer, is the starting point for everything else.
The second question is, what would need to be true about your life outside of work for it to feel full.
We spent a whole episode, episode 5, talking about the life career collision, about what happens when your personal life stops fitting around your professional one. This question is the other side of that. Not how do I make my life fit around my career, but what does a full life actually look like for me? And is my career currently making space for it or slowly crowding it?
Because for a lot of people, if they are honest, the answer to that second question reveals the gap more clearly than anything else. Your work might be going really well, but when was the last time you had a conversation with someone you love that wasn't interrupted, in the middle, or mentally you were half somewhere else? When was the last time you did something that had nothing to do with productivity? And when was the last time your life felt spacious?
And the third question, this is the one that ties it all together. Am I building towards those two things right now or away from them?
Not eventually, not in 5 years when things settle down. Right now. Are the decisions you're making today, the role you're in, the opportunities you're saying yes to, the ones you're saying no to, are they moving you closer to work that feels meaningful and the life that feels full? Or are they moving you in a direction that looks right from the outside but keeps those things just slightly out of reach?
And this is where enough stops being abstract. Because when you can answer those three questions honestly, you have a compass, not a plan, not a 5 year roadmap, a compass. Something that tells you in any given moment whether the direction you're moving in is actually yours.
And that is what makes the difference between chasing success and choosing it.
Chasing means the goalpost keeps moving and you keep running. Choosing means you know what you're building and you can feel the difference between a decision that moves you towards it and one that doesn't.
That's not settling. That's the most powerful thing a high achiever person can do, to stop outsourcing the definition of success to a system that was never designed with your specific life in mind.
And to start asking not what's next, but is this right for me right now as the person I'm actually today?
Because that question, asked honestly, answered honestly, is what enough actually looks like. Not a finish line, a feeling of being in the right direction, on purpose, by choice.
And once you have that, everything changes. Not because your circumstances change overnight, but because you change. The way you make decisions change. The things you say yes to change. The things you're finally willing to say no to change.
And that is what we are going into next. What it actually looks like to make decisions from that place.
We want to talk about something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the hardest things to do consistently. Making decisions based on who you are now. Not who you were when you first started building this career, not who you think you should be by this point, who you are now, today.
Because here's what we have noticed: most people make career decisions from one of the two places. The first is the past. I've always been someone who pushes for more. I've always been the ambitious one. I've always said yes to an opportunity. And those things might have been true. They might still be true. But always is a dangerous word when it comes to knowing yourself.
Because always means you stopped checking. You decided who you were at some point of time in the past. And you've been making decisions consistently with that version of yourself ever since, even if that version no longer fully fits.
The second place people make decisions from is the future. I will figure out what I actually want once I get to the next level, once that project is done, once the kid is older, once things settle down.
But things don't really settle down, they just change shape. And the version of you that exists in that imagined future, The one who finally has clarity, finally has space, finally has permission to want something different, that version is waiting for something that isn't coming.
Because the only place a decision can actually be made is now, by the person you are right now, with the information you have right now about what actually matters to you right now.
And this is where we want to bring it all the way back. 8 episodes. We started with identity, with what breaks when your professional structure collapses, with the question, who am I without the role?
And in some ways, that's still the question, just asked from a completely different place. Not from the rubble of something that fell apart, but from the quiet of something that has been working, maybe too well and for a long time.
Because both situations are asking you the same thing. Strip away the title, strip away the trajectory, strip away what other people expect out of you and what path is in front of you is already pointing towards. And ask yourself, what do I actually want?
And if that question is hard to answer, well, that's good. That means you're taking it seriously.
Because the people who answer it too quickly are usually answering the version of the question they're most comfortable with. The real answer takes a little longer to surface. It's quieter, it's less polished, it doesn't always make logical sense on a career trajectory spreadsheet.
But it's yours. And decisions made from that place, decisions that are aligned with what you actually want now, feel very different.
Not necessarily easy. Sometimes the most aligned decision is also the most uncomfortable one. Saying no to an opportunity that looks impressive but pulls you further from what matters. Staying somewhere where everything around you says you should be pushing for more. Leaving something that looks great on paper but has stopped feeling like yours.
None of those are small decisions. But there's a quality to them when they come from the right place, a kind of groundedness. Like, even if it is hard, I know why I am doing it.
And that knowing, that is what alignment actually feels like. It's not a feeling of everything being perfect, it's a feeling of I'm moving in a direction I would consciously choose. Not one I fell into, not one I inherited, but one that I chose.
And we want you to be honest. That feeling doesn't arrive and then stay forever. It needs to be revisited because you keep evolving. And what aligns now might need to be recalibrated a year from now.
Which is actually the point. This isn't a one time exercise, it's a practice. The practice of checking in, not just with your career trajectory, but with yourself. Asking regularly, honestly, is this still right for me?
Not, is this still impressive? Not, is this what I said I wanted 2 years ago? Not, is this what makes sense on paper? Is this still right for me?
Because the professionals who seem to navigate transitions with the most clarity, they're not the ones who had everything figured out from the beginning. They're the ones who never stopped asking that question.
And they are the ones who gave themselves permission to let the answer change.
Which brings us to the final thing we want to say, not just in this episode, but across all 8 of them.
Because if there is one thing we hope this series has given you, it's not a framework, it's not the 5 step plan.
It's permission. Permission to take your own experience seriously, to ask the questions that don't have clean answers, to sit in the discomfort of not knowing long enough to actually find out.
Permission to let your ambition evolve, to redefine success on your own terms, to say, this is what I want, not what I used to want. Now, what I want you to think is also sit with this question, not what I'm supposed to want and not what I used to want. It's always what I want right now.
And to recognize that knowing that is not the end of ambition. It is the beginning of a much more intentional one. 8 weeks ago, we opened a room, not a webinar, not a masterclass, not a space full of tactics and templates and things to optimize. A room.
A room for the conversations that usually happen privately in your head at 11 p.m., on a long drive home, in the silence after a meeting that should have felt like a win, but somehow it didn't.
We built this room because we kept seeing the same thing. Highly capable women, externally composed, internally asking questions they didn't know how to voice.
Questions like, why does this feel so hard when I'm doing everything right? Why do I feel stuck when nothing is technically wrong? Why does success feel like something I'm always approaching but never quite arriving at?
And those questions, as uncomfortable as they are not signs of weakness. They are signs of awareness, of a person who has grown past the point where the standard answers are just not enough.
So we spent 8 weeks inside those questions together.
We talked about what actually breaks when a career falls apart and why it's never just about the job.
We talked about why the hardest workers are often the ones who get overlooked and what it actually takes to move forward at senior levels.
We talked about how competence, the very thing that built your career, can quietly become the ceiling you can't get past.
We sat with a question most people spend years avoiding: should I stay or should I go? And we didn't pretend it had a simple answer.
We talked about what happens when life stops fitting around your career plan, when your priorities shift, when your body asks for something different, when the people who love you start needing more of you than your calendar has left to give.
We talked about pace, about what it feels like when you and your environment are moving at completely different speeds, and how that gap can make you feel like the problem when you are not.
And last week, we went somewhere quieter. We talked about the invisible cost of building something real. How success doesn't just give you things, it also slowly, quietly takes things. And how you rarely see that until it's already shaped the entire structure of your life.
And today, we ask the question that sits underneath it all: how do you know when you have reached a version of success that actually works? Not for the system, not for the market, not for the version of you that started this journey. For you right now.
And here's what we want to leave you with: there is no perfect answer. There is no moment where everything clicks into place and stays there forever.
But there is something that gets clearer the more honest you look at it: a sense of direction that feels chosen, not inherited, not defaulted into, not performed for an audience that isn't even watching. Chosen.
And that sense of moving in a direction you would consciously pick is what we've been building towards across all 8 of these conversations.
Not a destination, a practice. The practice of knowing yourselves clearly enough to make decisions that actually fit your life.
So, if you've been with us from the very beginning, once again, thank you. Not just for showing up, but for being willing to sit with the hard questions, for choosing reflection over reaction, for giving yourself the kind of honest attention that most people reserve for everything except themselves.
That is not a small thing. In a world that constantly tells you to move faster, choosing to slow down and actually look at where you're going takes courage.
And if this is the first episode you're hearing, go back to the beginning. Not because you need to, but because this conversation is part of something larger and you deserve the whole arc.
Because the decisions you're making right now are not just about what comes next, they're about who you are becoming.
And who you're becoming deserves to be chosen, not just happened into.
This has been the Transition Room: 8 episodes, one conversation. and we hope the beginning of a much more intentional relationship with your career.
We'll see you on the other side. Thank you for joining. Bye bye.
Bye bye.